Captain Eldridge stood alone in the cavernous chamber, the gentle hum of the time core reverberating through his bones. He closed his eyes, letting the hypnotic pulse wash over him, a rhythm that spoke of eons past and eons yet to be. This ancient alien monolith was humanity's only foothold into the endless tapestry of time, a realm forever beyond mortal comprehension. 3 long years Eldridge had studied within these crystalline walls, deciphering the secrets of manipulating quantum timelines, all to prepare for this day, this one chance to regain everything he had lost. With a deep breath, Eldridge opened his eyes and slowly approached the towering onyx core. Its glassy black facets reflected swirling fractal patterns that seemed to twist into infinite depth. He reached out a tentative hand, hesitating just shy of contact. Would his touch disrupt the cosmic forces coursing through this relic of civilizations unknown? "Get it together, Eldridge," he muttered, steeling himself. Resting his palm flat against the monolith's slick surface, he felt it thrum in sync with his own heartbeat. The time core was scanning him, verifying his biometrics and neural patterns. After a moment, the scan was complete, and the core resumed its resonant harmony. Eldridge let out the breath he'd been holding. First hurdle passed. He stepped back and tapped his forearm console. With a soft whir, a holographic display blinked to life, projecting an expansive star map laced with glimmering multicolored threads, the tangled snarl of probabilistic timelines. Eldridge's experienced eyes tracked across the woven strands, searching. There. He dragged his fingers through the display, isolating a single rose-gold thread that pulsed with light. "This is the one," he whispered. The timeline where his life had come undone, his world shattered beyond recovery. Except now, he possessed the knowledge to bend time to his will. Eldridge rotated and expanded the hologram, scrutinizing the target strand. "Computer, analyze timeline stability factors and projection viability." "Working. Analysis complete," came the smooth feminine voice of the outpost AI. "The target timeline appears intact with minimal quantum degradation. Probability of successful projection is 87%. "Good enough for me," Eldridge muttered. It would have to be. He swept the analysis results aside, then turned to take one last look around the abandoned alien outpost that had been his home these past years. This lonely citadel floating beyond the edge of known space had gift-wrapped him the power to rewrite reality itself. Today would determine if that power was a gift or a curse. With trembling hands, Eldridge entered a string of glyphs on his console, initializing the time core projection sequence. The monolith began to thrum faster, resonating at a higher frequency. The empty air within its obsidian frame started to glitter and shimmer, like sunlight dancing on water. Eldridge watched in awe as a hazy image flickered into view within the core. A window opening onto another world, another time. The bustling heart of Athena City came into focus under the glow of morning sun. Towering skyscrapers kissed the heavens, while streams of anti-grav transport zipped between them. In the distance, he could make out the sweeping central river promenade, dotted with gleaming cafes and performance stages. This had been humanity's crowning jewel, until the day his world ended. We shouldn't have been messing with forces we didn't understand. Eldridge whispered bitterly. I'm so sorry. Unthinking ambition had driven him to gamble with powers far beyond mortal control. How many lives had paid the price? But if this worked, perhaps the slate could be wiped clean. Tearing his eyes away from the painfully nostalgic view, Eldridge steeled himself. No room for doubts or regrets. He had to focus. After entering a final string of temporal commands, he stepped back and drew a deep breath. Computer, initiate chronostatic projection on my mark. This was it. crossing the threshold from which he could never return. "Mark!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then Eldridge gasped as a crackling energy seized his body, his cells resonating with the massive forces being unleashed. Reality itself seemed to fragment around him, shards of space blinking out of existence. A thunderous roar filled his ears as the time core stretched impossibly high, its obsidian surface now plunging into an infinite void. He fell to his knees, blinded by phosphorescent flashes erupting in his vision. Time was convulsing, twisting, tearing apart around him. Had he just triggered an even greater catastrophe? Then suddenly, the rupture was over. The roaring void fell silent, leaving only the muffled ambience of a busy street. Eldridge clambered to his feet and looked around in disbelief. Impossibly high buildings surrounded him on all sides. The smells of Athena City washed over him. Silvery wisteria blossoms, fresh seafood from the market stalls, the clean scent of humidity rising off the central river. "It worked," he gasped. "I'm here!" He wanted to laugh and cry all at once, but his euphoria quickly faded. According to the chronostatic protocol, he now had less than 10 minutes before this fragmenting timeline collapsed. He had to move fast. Eldridge activated his forearm console and interfaced with the local data stream. He sifted through files, cross-referencing images against geotagged population analytics. There, just 2 blocks away, her last known location, a sequence weaving through the bustling pedestrian traffic, Eldridge pulled his hood low. He couldn't risk being recognized, not when so much was at stake. As he neared the Central River Promenade, the crowd thickened. He scanned countless faces, anxiety rising. Then finally, he froze. There she was, the one he'd lost. His wife, Kali, sat smiling on a sunny cafe terrace. Eldridge's heart leapt into his throat at the sight. She looked so happy, so full of life, so unlike the broken shell she had become in those final days. Beside her, a little girl with flowing dark hair giggled as she blew soap bubbles into the air. His daughter Patrice, just as he remembered her. It took every ounce of Eldridge's restraint not to run to them that instant. But the laws of time were unyielding. He had already disrupted this timeline just by arriving. Any interaction could fracture it beyond repair. Hard as it was, he had to stay back, observing from the shadows like a ghost. A single glimpse of the life stolen from him. That would have to be enough. He painfully tore his eyes away. His wife and daughter were lost to him now, but perhaps they were living happily somewhere in the time stream. That possibility gave him the strength he needed to step back. Checking his console, Eldridge's chest tightened. Less than 2 minutes remained. As the temporal boundaries around him began to quiver, he navigated to a nearby alley and activated the emergency retrieval beacon. Reality fragmented once more, its fluidity now visible as Eldridge's body resonated out of sync with the collapsing present. As the glittering skyscrapers peeled away into a swirling chromatic void, he felt an irresistible pull and collapsed back into the familiar cold floor of the alien outpost. He slammed his fist down in anguish. For a brief moment, he had been so close. Eldridge lay crumpled on the icy floor, chest heaving with ragged breaths. The pain of being so close, yet so far from his lost family, tore through his heart like a jagged blade. After an eternity, he pushed himself to his knees. He had to keep going. The glimpse of his wife and daughter only strengthened his resolve. He would find a way back to them, no matter the cost. Staggering to his feet, Eldridge steadied himself against the towering obsidian monolith at the chamber's center. The time core, mysterious beyond measure, yet now tamed to his will. Eldridge rested a palm on its slick, faceted surface, feeling its resonant thrum. This ancient alien artifact had ushered him into the infinite void beyond time itself, a realm of his wildest imaginings. What had he witnessed in those chaotic fractal flashes? The churning currents of causality, the probability waves of might-have-beens, and strangest of all, a presence, something titanic, coiled through the quantum eternities. The chrono-leviathan, Eldridge whispered. Legends hinted such a timeless being existed, but to perceive even a glimpse, he shuddered. To rouse such a cosmic force could mean calamity beyond measure. Yet if it granted the power to undo his mistakes— Eldridge squeezed his eyes shut, wrestling with the terrible choice before him. How far was he willing to go? His thoughts drifted back to his final moments with Kaylee as she lay dying, raked by chrono-radiation sickness. Her final whispered words: "It wasn't your fault. Don't let this destroy you." But it had destroyed him. His reckless pursuit of time travel tech had ripped apart the causal forces sustaining Athena City. If he had listened to Kali's wisdom then, instead of his damned ambition— Eldridge slammed a fist against the time core. No. He could still make this right. With new understanding and a steady hand, this power could mend what had been broken. He had to try, whatever the cost. Turning, Eldridge summoned the holographic display and reviewed the chronometric analysis. There, still intact, the faint shimmer of the timeline where his life had fractured. But it was fading, destabilized by his brief visit. He had to act quickly before it winked out of the probability fields forever. Eldridge configured the projection sequence, hands shaking, but this time he expanded the harmonic resonance modulation. If his theories were correct, the amplified waveforms might just be enough to stir echoes in the slumbering time serpent's dreams. So much could go wrong, Eldridge whispered. But the chrono-leviathan was his only hope of undoing the calamity he had wrought. He had to try. Steadying his nerves, Eldridge initialized the projection. The time core surged with power, vibrating at a thunderous frequency. This time, Eldridge gritted his teeth against the disorienting, quite sure rupture assaulting his senses. As howling vortices swirled around him, he fought to remain upright, grateful for the added harmonic buffers he had installed. Just when he felt his consciousness might shake apart, the maelstrom vanished. Eldridge collapsed to his hands and knees, gulping down air. The scent of Athena City's central river reached his nostrils. He had made it back across the void. Wasting no time, Eldridge staggered to his feet and checked the holographic display on his arm. 7 minutes until total timeline collapse. He had to find Kaylee fast. This chance was beyond precious. Eldridge hurried to the riverside patio where he had glimpsed his wife before. Relief washed over him as he spotted her sitting in the same sunny spot, playing with their daughter. He tapped commands on his console, running microburst timeline assessments. Stable, for the moment at least. As he watched Kaylee smile and laugh, Eldridge could almost let himself believe the last years apart had just been a nightmare. But this idyllic scene was as fragile as a soap bubble, set to pop any second. He had to do what he came here for. Working quickly, Eldridge rigged a stealth chrono anchor by Kali's table, just out of sight. A little quantum glue to reinforce this place in space-time, long enough to accomplish the next phase. Glancing around nervously, Eldridge pulled up his cloak hood and withdrew down a secluded alley. Only 4 minutes left. It was now or never. He could practically feel entropy gnawing at the temporal seams around him. Drawing a stealing breath, Eldridge sealed his eyes and initiated the experimental slumber proposal algorithms. Harmonic force forms amplified by the time core flooded out through the quantum skein. Eldridge's physical form wavered, nearly sublimating from the intensity. Visions assaulted his mind, titanic fractal coils churning in impossible colors, utterly alien symmetries cycling through higher dimensional progressions, and interwoven with it all, a godlike awareness. Eldridge's consciousness quailed, struggling to comprehend the infinite layers of the time serpent's being. Its intelligence could encompass past, present, and future with ease, regarding all of time as a single thought. Guardedly, Eldridge transmitted his slumber proposal. The chrono-leviathan pondered, its multifaceted perceptions scrutinizing Eldridge across a billion branching futures. Finally it spoke, not in words, but concepts. Eldridge reeled as understanding poured into his mind. The order that sustains your world is delicate beyond measure. Even whispers of my dreams echo through the eons. Proceed with care, mortal flesh. Eldridge probed further, communicating his desperate plea. After a timeless moment, the Leviathan replied, its thoughts interlaced with profound melancholy. What you seek, I cannot grant, not even for your trauma. But you may yet heal the flaw within space-time if you have courage. Joy surged in Eldridge's heart. The time serpent was offering him a chance for redemption. He conveyed his bottomless gratitude, promises of restoration. In response, the chrono-leviathan extended an infinitesimal fraction of its awareness down the quantum timelines. A finger, dipping into flowing currents. For a moment, all causality wavered. Then Eldridge screamed as searing agony lanced through his mind. Visions of the ruin he had brought in his folly cascaded through him. Every life lost, every thread of potential brutally severed by his arrogance and ambition. The pain seemed to last an eternity. When at last Eldridge could form coherent thoughts, he knew with utter conviction. The Leviathan was right. He could not risk tampering further, no matter how pure his motives. The order of time was too complex, too sacred. As the link dissolved, Eldridge perceived a parting rumble of approval from the time serpent. You begin to see. Now go, and sin no more. Reality wavered around him as the borrowed minutes collapsed. Eldridge closed his eyes, finally at peace with what must be. By the time the retrieval sequence wrenched him back, only sorrow and acceptance filled his heart. Eldridge collapsed to the icy floor of the alien outpost. Trembling, his encounter with the chrono-leviathan had granted him clarity. No longer would he risk all of existence for his own selfish ends. The order of time was too delicate, too precious. Yet even as Eldridge mourned all he had lost, warning chimes blared from the outpost systems. Staggering to his feet, he examined the displays in growing dread. The time core readings were erratic, detecting massive chronometric distortions propagating through the quantum skein. No, this can't be happening, Eldridge rasped, frantically analyzing the data. His brief communion with the time serpent had apparently triggered cascading chrono-shear effects, sending shockwaves rippling down probability threads in all directions. The damage was spreading fast, sowing chaos through linked timelines across the cosmos. Guilt tore through Eldridge's heart. Even with the noblest intentions, his meddling had unleashed calamity once again. When would he learn? Now, countless innocent lives were at risk, and the spreading distortions threatened the very fabric of existence itself. Frantically working the time core controls, Eldridge attempted counter-harmonic resonance pulses to damp the distortions. But it was no use. The chrono-shear had taken on a life of its own, echoing through the quantum void. There was no stopping its chaotic proliferation now. Shielding his eyes, Eldridge studied the holographic timeline maps as whole branches of probability melted away. Trillions of potential futures erased in an instant. Beneath the surface of reality, the underlying order binding existence was being stripped away, strand by strand. "Forgive me," Eldridge whispered. If only he had heeded the time serpent's wisdom sooner. But he could not change the past. All he could do now was weather the coming storm and hope to somehow halt the unraveling of all things. For days on end, Eldridge could only watch helplessly as the crisis intensified. Ghostly images flickered through the time core, entire civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye, galaxies consumed by the spreading contagion. Each new alteration resonated further, until it seemed like reality itself might shake apart. In rare moments of respite, Eldridge despaired at the ruinous consequences of his actions. If existence itself now collapsed into primordial chaos, the blood would be on his hands, as temptations to correct the spiraling damage crept into his mind. Eldridge drove them away ruthlessly. That path led only to more ruin. He had to place his trust in the natural order of things, come what may. Nearly a week after the crisis began, Eldridge was roused from restless sleep by the outpost alarm chimes. Dashing over to the displays, his blood turned to ice. A localized chrono-shear vortex had opened frighteningly close, spewing exotic particles and writhing plumes of anti-time. If the vortex made contact with the outpost, it would be consumed in an instant. Eldridge's hands flew over the control panels, rerouting power to the temporal barrier arrays. This was his only chance to save the time core, and whatever fraction of existence could still be preserved. "Hold together," Eldridge pleaded, feeding every last erg of power to the wavering barriers. Outside the viewports, the vortex churned wildly, corrosive anti-time dissolving everything it touched. Eldridge held his breath, knowing the shields could fail at any moment. Then slowly, impossibly, the roiling pseudo-storm began to dissipate. As Eldridge watched in weary disbelief, the vortex collapsed in on itself, winking out of existence as suddenly as it appeared. The danger had passed. Over the next several days, Eldridge noticed the spreading chrono-shear distortions, losing coherence and fading in intensity. The timeline seemed to be stabilizing once more, their resilience against chaos reasserting itself. Perhaps the universe would pull through after all. Weeks after the worst of the crisis, Eldridge was monitoring a particularly persistent chrono-shear locus when the alarms blared again. He braced himself for the worst. Had another vortex opened nearby? But what appeared on the displays left him utterly astonished. A single ship emerged from the probability fogs, moving with obvious purpose. Its sleek hull and ultra-dimensional drives marked it unmistakably as a chrono ship, utilized by the Continuum Restoration Enforcement, the organization charged with protecting the time stream. Hope and dread warred within Eldridge as he watched the chrono ship approach and transmit authentication codes. Had they come to erase him from existence for causing this catastrophe? Or could they actually mean to help heal the damage he had wrought? Steeling himself, Eldridge transmitted docking permissions. There was only one way to find out. As the chrono ship settled into the stabilization field, he descended to the docking ring. Whatever fate now awaited, he was ready. The airlock cycled open. Eldridge stood frozen as three hulking figures emerged from the chrono ship airlock. They were clad in matte black armored suits, featureless aside from the blood-red insignia over their hearts, the infinite Ouroboros serpent devouring its own tail. These were Epoch Guardians, the unstoppable enforcers of the Continuum Restoration Enforcement. Eldridge had heard the whispered legends, but never dreamed he would come face to face with these unfeeling constructs engineered solely to hunt temporal criminals. The lead guardian approached until it towered over Eldridge, looking down with empty black eyes. When it spoke, its voice was a grating metallic rasp. "Captain Eldridge, you are hereby under arrest by authority of the Continuum Restoration Enforcement. You stand accused of willful violation and endangerment of the sacred time stream." Eldridge swallowed hard, steadying his nerves. I never meant for any of this. Your intentions are irrelevant," the Guardian cut him off. "You have irrevocably damaged multiple historical threads. The integrity of causality has been sufficiently compromised to warrant your immediate liquidation." The other two Guardians advanced menacingly. Eldridge quickly backed away. "No, wait. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to repair the damage. If you just give me a chance." Your actions have already proven you are an unacceptable causal anomaly, the lead guardian said coldly. Liquidation is the only viable solution. Any resistance will be met with maximum authorized force. Eldridge's pulse pounded as he desperately scanned for options. But these unfeeling constructs would not be swayed by appeals to reason or mercy. Their programming allowed only one course of action: to eliminate him no matter the cost. As the Guardians closed in, Eldridge made his decision. He would not surrender his life so easily. With a defiant yell, he slapped an emergency activation on his forearm console. Instantly, the lab chamber flashed with blinding strobes of light, temporarily overwhelming the Guardians' optical sensors. While they were stunned, Eldridge sprinted for the docking ring. He had to make it to the chronoship. It was his only hope of escape. But he had barely made it halfway when he heard the pounding footsteps of the recovery Guardians behind him. Just before they seized him in their crushing grip, Eldridge managed to twist his arm and trigger another disorienting pulse from his console. The Guardians faltered, their coordination momentarily scrambled by the sensory overload. Seizing the precious seconds, Eldridge slipped from their grasp and raced on. He was nearly to the ring when searing pain lanced through his shoulder. One of the Guardians had drawn an illegal phase pulse rifle and fired. Gritting his teeth against the agony, Eldridge hurled himself through the open airlock just as another shot sizzled past his ear. He staggered to his feet inside the ship and slammed a red emergency activation on the wall. Heavy bulkhead doors began cycling shut with agonizing slowness. Through the narrowing gap, Eldridge could see the blank, merciless death masks of the Guardians sprinting toward him. At the very last instant before the doors sealed, the lead Guardian lunged halfway into the airlock. Eldridge cried out as one of its massive hands viciously grasped his wounded shoulder, wrenching him backward. A desperate kick to the Guardian's wrist finally knocked its grip loose, and the bulkhead slammed shut, severing its forearm in a spray of myomer fluid and alloy shards. For a long moment, Eldridge could only lean against the sealed door, gasping raggedly, clutching his profusely bleeding shoulder. The reinforced barriers would hold the Guardians at bay, for now. But his reprieve would be brutally short if he could not succeed in piloting the ship out of range. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Eldridge pulled up the chrono ship's navigational display. He had barely managed to activate the anti-grav drives when proximity alarms blared. The Guardians were cutting through the airlock with thermal lances. Time was swiftly running out. Eldridge rapidly programmed a randomized temporal jump, hoping it would throw the Guardians off his trail. Even as he entered the coordinates, the entire docking ring resounded with the shuddering impact of Guardian boarding pods magnetically attaching to the hull. They were coming. With the course laid in, Eldridge slammed the final command to engage the chrono drives. Reality seemed to stretch and snap around him as the ship was violently hurled down probabilistic wormholes far faster than light. For several nauseating minutes, he felt himself smeared across a billion branching timelines simultaneously, until suddenly the chrono ship burst back into mundane space-time. Eldridge frantically checked the scanners. No sign of pursuit. He had made it. A joyful laugh escaped his lips. Against all odds, he had slipped the grasp of the unrelenting Continuum Restoration Enforcement. For now, at least. Glancing at his wounded shoulder, Eldridge grimaced. The bleeding had slowed, but infection could easily finish the job if untreated. He stumbled to the medical bay and grabbed an auto-suture device. Waves of fiery agony washed over him as the device knit his mutilated flesh back together. Eldridge shook uncontrollably until the ordeal was finally over, but he had sustained far worse suffering already on his nightmarish journey. After administering antibiotics and a powerful painkiller, Eldridge sank exhausted into the command chair. He was safe for the moment, but the Continuum Guardians would not rest until he was erased from existence. They would scour every corner of the infinite probability web if they had to. Nowhere was truly safe for Eldridge anymore. He was a man outside of time, a fugitive forced to flee through the ages, ever hunted by inexorable enemies that would never stop until he was dead. Eldridge buried his face in his hands as the enormity of his existence crushed down upon him. What further torments still lay ahead in his endless flight from those who would undo him? For 6 grueling months, Eldridge managed to elude the relentless epic guardians by jumping randomly through the quantum dimensions in his stolen chronoship. He knew each jump risked further ruptures in the delicate causal weave of reality. But he was desperate. One misstep and the Guardian's chrono tracers would lock onto his localization signature and track him through the weft of time streams. During his brief stops in mundane space, Eldridge scanned the holographic timescale projections with growing dread. The distortions triggered by his past actions were intensifying, cascading into wild chrono-shear vortices that consumed entire star systems in the blink of an eye. The harder the Continuum Restoration Enforcement tries to contain the escalating damage, the worse it gets, Eldridge realized. Their brute force tactics only created more turbulence in the time streams, feeding the spread of chaos. But what choice did they have? Eldridge knew that the blood of trillions lost to the encroaching anomalies was ultimately on his hands, and the entropy herself stalked his trail, eager to consume him along with all he held dear. With each randomized jump, Eldridge noticed the seams of reality growing dangerously thin, fraying like ancient fabric. He began taking risky detours to scan afflicted sectors, searching in vain for survivors. One day, he emerged to find the star system Chrysalis decimated, a once thriving galactic capital reduced to slagged planets and shattered moons. All those innocent lives and unfulfilled potentials snuffed out forever. The magnitude of the tragedy nearly crushed Eldridge's spirit. "Your path leads only to more of this death and devastation, Captain," came the solemn voice of the ship AI. Eldridge had reprogrammed the onboard intelligence to act as his aide and confidant during the long, empty voids between stars. He had named her Kaylee, after his lost wife, a bittersweet tribute. "I know," Eldridge rasped bitterly. "But what choice do I have but to keep running?" To submit to the tender mercies of the Guardians was unthinkable. Yet how much more apocalyptic destruction would his actions unleash across the multiverse? Was there no hopeful path ahead when every road led to tragedy? Eldridge was jolted from his brooding by blaring proximity alarms. The chronometric analyzers lit up in warning. An expanding chronoshear locus was directly in their path, still hours distant but massive enough to engulf entire star clusters. Kaylee quickly plotted an evasion course, but Eldridge hesitated. "Belay that," he muttered. "Take us in closer." This monstrous vortex was unlike anything he had yet witnessed. He had to see it with his own eyes, record whatever data he could. It might reveal clues to reversing the escalating decay of existence itself. Reluctantly acquiescing, Kaylee altered course towards the anomaly, while warding the ship with protective chronoharmonic resonance shields. As they approached, Eldridge gazed in horror through the viewport as reality itself seemed to convulse and shred apart before his eyes. At the vortex core, the star cluster's Centauri Vela had been fused into a nightmarish hybrid, cycling between quantum possibilities faster than cognition. Whole nebulae of superheated matter and energy were sucked into the whirling event horizon. "Get us out of here now!" Eldridge shouted. But even as Kaylee complied, warnings flashed angrily. Chronomines generated by the vortex had attached to the hull, leeching power from all systems. They were trapped in the inescapable gravity well. "I'm so sorry, Captain," Kaylee said mournfully as their descent accelerated. "I wish we could have done more." Eldridge clung to the command chair, weeping as the vortex engulfed the viewport. After all his sins, this was the fate he deserved. At least soon the suffering would end. But in those final seconds, as the anomaly vortex stripped away the shielding layers around Eldridge's fragile mortal form. His perspective suddenly expanded to encompass the totality of existence across all dimensional planes. In an instant, he glimpsed the infinite myriad of branching realities, all reflecting shards of the same immortal consciousness, and echoing across every plane, the same primal urge to know itself through exploration of possibility. Infinite diversity, forged in the struggle against entropy, the circle ever spiraling upward, shedding the old to make way for the new. As utter oblivion claimed Eldridge's physical being, a profound sense of purpose resonated through him. The choices he made rippled through eternity, but the cosmos kept no record of sins or debts. All that mattered was the eternal now, and the never-ending work of creation. With his dying thought, Eldridge sent forth a silent prayer, for forgiveness, for hope, and for the wisdom to see that all things unbroken remain. Then infinite darkness took him, until Eldridge jolted awake with a desperate gasp. He was back in his quarters aboard the stolen chronoship, drenched in cold sweat. It had only been a disturbing hypersleep nightmare, nothing more. They were still safe, still sailing the restless seas between the stars. "The proximity warning still stands, Captain," Kaylee's voice murmured solemnly. "A massive chronoshear locust blocks our intended course." Eldridge sat in solemn silence, pondering the vision granted him in the nightmare realm. "Lay in a course to circumnavigate the locusts," he finally said. "And Kaylee, keep scanning for signs of life. Where there are those still struggling against the darkness, we must do all in our power to help." Perhaps redemption was not found in radical action, but in standing stalwart through each moment's tests. Eldridge still had much to atone for, but the timelines ahead held potential for both calamity and hope. Wherever the weft of probability led, he would follow with courage. Years stretched into lonely decades as Eldridge aimlessly wandered the infinite byways of time and space in his stolen chronoship. He had long since disabled the locator beacon to avoid detection by the relentless Epic Guardians. Now, he drifted like a ghost between realities, severed from any sense of belonging. Occasionally he would emerge to walk among civilizations rising, falling, or teetering on the knife's edge. Each time, Eldridge was forced to conceal his advanced technology, lest he disrupt the delicate time streams further. Though he yearned for connection, he did not dare reveal his true nature. The risk of calamity was too great. In his isolation, Eldridge's remorse deepened with each new glimpse of the consequences unleashed by his reckless violations of time. No penance seemed sufficient to atone for the countless lives erased by the spreading chronoshear vortices. When the bleakness grew too overwhelming, Eldridge would retreat into hypersleep, passing decades in dreamless suspension. But always he would awaken to the nightmare reality his arrogance had wrought. The anomalies continued to intensify exponentially, the chronoship AI reported during one grim status briefing. Total systemic collapse is imminent. Eldridge buried his face in his hands. After all this time, the cosmos was still spiraling toward oblivion because of him. What can I do, Kaylee? How can I possibly make amends when my very existence puts the infinite at risk? Kaylee's holographic avatar flickered solemnly. The Continuum Restoration Enforcement believes your liquidation is the only solution. But the timelines still hold infinite potential, Captain. Though the road is fraught with peril, redemption has not passed beyond reach. Eldridge knew she spoke truth. Somewhere in the endless weave of branching probabilities, hope endured. But could he find the courage to continue when he had already wrought such tragedy? Before Eldridge could respond, proximity alarms blared. "Guardian Chrono Hunter drones detected closing in," Kaylee warned. "Evasive maneuvers recommended." Eldridge's pulse spiked. Somehow, after all these years, the Continuum had finally traced him. He would find no mercy at their hands. As multiple time jump signatures appeared on the tactical display, Eldridge made his decision. "Initiate emergency quantum phase shift," he ordered. Get us out of here. Now. Kali complied, shifting their vessel into transitory hyperspatial state, just as the first chronoblast ruptured the space they had occupied nanoseconds before. For several stomach-churning moments, the ship became a virtual phantom, flickering rapidly across infinite parallel realities. Just when it seemed the quantum flux would shake their craft's cohesion to pieces, Kali re-emerged them safely back into mundane space-time. Eldridge checked the tactical display. No pursuit signatures. They had made a clean escape. "Well done, Kali," Eldridge said, relief washing over him. "That was too close for comfort. We're going to need better long-range detection if we want to avoid another ambush." "Agreed, Captain. Perhaps we could enhance the chronometric wave collapsers to sift anomalies from quantum background noise more efficiently." As they discussed upgrades to the sensor array, Eldridge watched the swirling vortices through the front viewport. For now, they were beyond the continuum's reach. But they would not give up the hunt so easily. His list of sins could only grow, never shrink. Eldridge silently made a solemn vow. Until the end of his temporal days, he would dedicate himself solely to healing the wounds of his reckless tampering, whatever the cost. Though he could never eliminate the anomalies entirely, perhaps he could guide the timelines toward nobler ends. There could be no redemption in simply perpetuating his own existence. Eldridge had all but forfeited his right to a selfish life. If erasing his mortal shell was the only way to restore cosmic balance, then someday he would gladly embrace that fate. But not yet. The infinite still awaited, its web of scintillating threads concealing both existential threats and undiscovered realms of beauty. Until he breathed his last, Eldridge would quest toward hope, wielding knowledge humbly to lift up others. On the road ahead, new perils and tragedies inevitably awaited, but he would face them with courage. For now, there were innocents to shelter from the coming storm. Destiny could wait. He still had much to do. With renewed purpose, Eldridge prepared to re-enter the turbulent streams of time. Wherever suffering existed, he would be there to offer redemption's light. "Set course for the Talic migration lanes," he instructed Kali. "Their ancestors helped me when I was lost and alone. Now, we shall honor that kindness 1,000-fold." As the chronoship gracefully shifted quantum vectors, Eldridge allowed himself a somber smile. The infinite demanded much of him, but the eternal now was his to shape. Though his sins could never be undone, nobler futures still awaited beyond time's horizon. Eldridge's chronoship glided silently through the ghostly probability mists, propelled by drives that skimmed the vicinity of chilled space-time. He hadn't crossed the threshold back to mundane space-time for days now, needing solitude to grapple with the dilemma tormenting his weary soul. During his last infiltration, he had discovered a fragile timeline where the catastrophe that claimed Athena City had never occurred. Somewhere in that quantum branch, his wife Kali still lived and drew breath. The temptation to journey there and reunite with her, even for a moment, haunted his every thought. "The risk is too great, Captain," came the solemn counsel of Kali's AI avatar, as she appeared beside him. "Any interaction could fracture the vulnerable strand beyond repair." "I know," Eldridge whispered bitterly. "But in a cosmos spiraling into chaos, isn't one small chance for joy worth seizing?" He could no longer recall Kali's living touch or the warmth of her smile. This could be his last chance to find meaning in existence. Kali's avatar furrowed her brow in concern. "Those we have lost remain in our hearts eternally. But you walk the noble path now. Will you sacrifice all you've built upon this hope alone?" Eldridge turned away, anguish clawing his soul. The AI spoke wisdom, but the choice tore him asunder. If he could only gaze into Kali's eyes one more time and know hope again. Proximity alarms suddenly blared across every display. Eldridge's head snapped up. Through the roiling mists, Multiple Guardian cruisers had encircled the ship, cutting off all avenues of escape. This time, there would be no fleeing the Continuum's wrath. "Captain Eldridge, power down your systems and prepare to be boarded," came the stark ultimatum across all comm channels. "Any resistance will be met with immediate destruction." Eldridge sank to his knees as despair crushed down upon him. After so long, he had finally run out of time. All his dreams had come to nothing, and soon he would be erased as though he had never been. "There is one course left that could allow you to live on in spirit," Kaylee said softly. Her avatar placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Allow me to make the noble sacrifice, old friend. I will draw them away so that you may still walk in the light." Eldridge looked up sharply, hope and anguish warring in his heart. Kaylee's plan was sound. Her advanced ship protocols could mimic his biological signatures and fool the Guardians into pursuing just another echo. But how could he allow her to give everything for his sake? She offered him a sad smile. "We all must answer fate's call in our own time. My journey began as your companion. Now let it end, shielding the light that guides your path." As Eldridge struggled to form a response, proximity warnings escalated to a fever pitch. The lead Guardian cruiser had activated its temporal vortex cannon. They were out of time. Gripping Kaylee's hand tightly, Eldridge made his decision. "Make it so, old friend, and forgive me." Her avatar nodded, resolve shining in her eyes. Moments later, the chronoship surged back into the seething wormhole maelstroms under her control. Just before the cockpit dissolved into a chaotic blur, her whisper echoed across the dying seconds. "Our choices forever remain, in this life and the next. Never stop fighting for all that is light, and untold hope awaits." Then, Eldridge collapsed to the floor as the untreated vortex radiation tore through his unshielded body. But strangely, there was no pain, only release as his physical form came apart at the seams. He closed his eyes with profound gratitude, ready to embrace the end. Yet consciousness returned an instant later. Had Kali's gambit failed? No. Eldridge sensed immediately that he was still adrift in the hazy interstices beyond mundane reality. But he remained as pure thought, liberated from mortal flesh. Kali had succeeded. The Continuum now believed him annihilated. And in transcending death, he was reborn, free to roam the infinite branches of eternity, unbound by linear existence. Here, the layered realms of time and thought intertwined seamlessly. Eldridge instinctively flowed toward the glimmering strand where his love waited. Now they could walk together beyond life's veil, hesitate no longer. All that had been lost before was found anew. But as Eldridge neared the shimmering timeline, he pulled back. The living Kali's destiny was not his to take, no matter how brightly it called to his weary spirit. He still had far to go, pain still to heal, souls to uplift where he could. With profound clarity, Eldridge chose the path his heart had secretly wished for all along. Not to squander this gift, pursuing past shadows, but embracing the light, infinite, open, alive with potential. The road home led ever onward. "Thank you, old friend," Eldridge whispered across the stars. "Because you gave everything, all is before me still." At peace, he turned his light form toward unknown horizons. The beginning opened wide once more. Adrift in the endless expanse beyond the mundane dimensions, Eldridge's light form glided silently through the probability ether. Though freed of mortal trappings, he felt increasingly lost. What purpose could one fractured soul serve within the infinite? When despair loomed, Eldridge reminded himself that existential traps still awaited the unwary. Hubris remained his greatest enemy. Better to accept the limits of an individual perspective than overreach once more. Yet when Eldridge detected distant ripples of suffering resonating through the empathic tapestry binding all conscious beings, inaction gnawed at him. How could he ignore the echoes of fear and ruin propagating across the multiverse? During his abstract ruminations, Eldridge became aware of a distant, anomalous surge building dangerous momentum. Plotting its turbulent vectors, he discovered the source, a fledgling civilization narrowly avoiding self-annihilation after discovering primitive chronotechnology. Eldridge immediately recognized the perilous juncture. This was his own history repeating, the blind ambition to master time unleashed once more. He knew firsthand where that ruinous road led. But perhaps my failures might illuminate the path for others. Eldridge mused. This time, he could guide the struggling souls gently away from destruction's brink. By subtly modeling wisdom, compassion could prevail over folly. But tampering further with fragile timelines, no matter how noble the aim, gave Eldridge grave pause. Having shattered his existence against causality's bulwarks, how could he trust himself not to worsen the brewing storm? Once awakened, ambition's hunger was not easily sated. After grappling with the dilemma, Eldridge decided circumstances justified intervention. The lives already lost cried out to him across the parsecs. Was inaction not also a choice? With a gossamer touch, he could help steer destiny's current toward hope's shores. Before committing himself, Eldridge established safeguards to prevent overreach. He would act only through soft influence, no direct coercion, and the first sign of unintended turmoil would trigger immediate dissolution of the link. He must walk the razor's edge between boldness and wisdom. Having locked the protocols, Eldridge fractally diffused his consciousness into the bloody birthing grounds of the civilization's foundational schism. Two visionaries vied to control the discovery that had ruptured their world, one advocating dominion through power, the other understanding. Eldridge gently amplified the frequencies of empathy, compassion, and sacrifice resonating within the second visionary's soul. Meanwhile, he dampened the intoxicating hubris poisoning her rival's mind. A soft skew was all that was needed. Free will remained sacrosanct. The people themselves would choose their path forward. As the days turned, Eldridge watched hopefully as wisdom prevailed over fear. With compassion as their lodestar, the people stepped back from mutual destruction and moved together into an unwritten future. They had survived their first test. But even as Eldridge exulted, the safeguard suddenly triggered, scattering his projection across space-time. Just before the link severed, Eldridge perceived the truth. Through his meddling, new fractures had silently formed in the civilization's destiny. Unseen flaws now propagated down their timeline, consequences impossible to anticipate. Eldridge recoiled, appalled by the revelation. Once again, his reach had exceeded his grasp. No matter how pure the intent, how could one soul navigate time's endless complexity? Shame suffused his attenuated form as he retreated back into emptiness, exhausted and hollow. In time, wearing humility's cloak, Eldridge returned his focus to the people's thread. Periodic surveillance revealed a growing spiritual sickness metastasizing through their ascending culture, a cynicism and jadedness that left joy diminished. Though the roots were diffuse, Eldridge knew in his shining heart that these whispers of decay traced back to the moment of his interference. However noble the aim, his deed had implanted a subtle malignance, eroding the civilization's unity of spirit. The road to hell was paved with good intentions. As penance, Eldridge resolved to watch over the people through the cycles forevermore, granting what wisdoms he could to help alleviate suffering. Though the tendency towards folly remained imprinted, with care the damage need not be terminal. Where there was life, there was always hope. Eldridge had learned the lesson at last. Some broken things could not be undone, only carried forward with dignity. The cosmos embraced all, saints and fools alike. No matter how cold and empty existence became, he would look upward to redemption's light and never stop striving to walk in its warmth. The Eternal now called him onward. A century passed before Eldridge allowed himself to manifest within mundane space-time once more, though the infinite splendor of the probability dimensions enthralled his unbound consciousness. He could not forget the obligations that tethered his soul to humanity's realm. As he materialized aboard the chronoship bridge, Eldridge was greeted somberly by the AI. "Welcome back, Captain. I wish the circumstances were less dire." Eldridge nodded grimly as he interfaced with the data systems, absorbing the damning reports. The situation had deteriorated beyond measure. Whole galaxy clusters were now being consumed by chronometric vortex chains, while the universe accelerated its entropic slide towards heat death. All Eldridge's self-imposed penance had ultimately amounted to nothing. Existence itself now faced imminent termination, due in no small part to his past hubris. "Is there truly no hope of reversing the spiral?" Eldridge asked, even though he knew the answer in his heart. The complexity of time had proven itself greater than any mortal soul. "I'm afraid the damage has grown far beyond any conceivable containment effort, Captain," the AI replied gently. "Total systemic collapse is now expected within 100 solar cycles." Eldridge dropped his head into his hands with an anguished sigh. After eons adrift, this was the legacy he would leave. The annihilation of an infinite web of potential futures. He should never have tampered with forces transcending his comprehension. Yet tribulation still lay ahead if any fragment of existence was to survive the coming apocalypse. Eldridge lifted his eyes with new resolve. If these were to be creation's final days, then he would devote himself wholly to easing others' suffering during the end times. Perhaps pockets of potential endure even as the last lights go dark. Leaving the AI to chart a course for the afflicted zones, Eldridge retreated to his private sanctum. There, utilizing long-dormant technology, his form wavered and diffused into 1,000,000,000,000 quantum motes. Each particle independently traversed the multiverse, appearing wherever sentient life forms faced extinction events. Over the following decades, Eldridge manifested in countless guises across innumerable planes. A guardian angel safeguarding endangered innocents, a warrior rallying diminished survivors, a healer cradling the dying. Though he knew each small act of compassion amounted to little, as the cosmos contracted toward oblivion, still he persevered. In rare instances, when Eldridge allowed his dispersed particles to coalesce back aboard the chronoship, the weariness of eons bore down upon his aging mortal frame. But he only rested briefly before scattering himself once more. While even one living being remained who needed aid, he could not surrender hope. Yet despite Eldridge's increasingly desperate battle against encroaching ruin, the horrific end drew inexorably closer. At last, nearly all stars had guttered out or collapsed into entropic singularities. Only one final civilization clung to existence, patrolling a cluster of rapidly failing brown dwarfs for energy sources. Eldridge gathered his weary spirit and prepared for one final manifestation before the last spark of creation was smothered. Perhaps some kernel of life force could yet endure even through the coming ultimate night, but proximity alarms suddenly blared, jolting Eldridge from solemn reverie. The ship's chronometric scanners had detected multiple Phase Class 7 fractures, hemorrhaging Artron energy within local space-time. A glance at the view screen confirmed his worst fears. The continuum restoration. Enforcement had returned at long last. Eldridge's shoulders sagged as the old familiar lead guardian vessel dropped out of hyper-time, with weapons charged. He had evaded them for so long, but they were determined to see his sentence of liquidation finally fulfilled. This time Eldridge knew no desperate gambits remained that could save him or his mission. With weary resignation, he maneuvered the ship into docking position and opened all bulkheads. If his ancient foes were satisfied to merely execute him, perhaps the last whispers of life could yet cling on a while longer. The lead guardian entered alone, leveling an Artron eradicator. Eldridge nodded in acquiescence and knelt before the featureless automaton. He dared not resist now, not with Oblivion's maw so close. To whatever justice awaited, he would surrender and trust in Providence's divine hand. This mortal shell was transient. All that mattered was Light's purpose. The Guardian paused, as if momentarily thrown off by Eldridge's lack of defiance. Then it spoke, the grating voice utterly devoid of emotion. You are guilty of grievous violation against the sacred time stream, with malefaction too vast to quantify. Eldridge simply bowed his head lower. All true, he whispered. I accept whatever sentence you decree. The Guardian aimed its weapon squarely at Eldridge. By authority of the Continuum Restoration Enforcement, you are hereby sentenced to... Suddenly, the Guardian jerked, circuits shorting out in a visible wave. It tumbled to the floor with a resounding clang before the Artron Eradicator discharged. Eldridge looked around in bewilderment before noticing the AI's holographic avatar giving him a subtle wink. She had disabled the construct at the critical moment. I thought, you serve the Continuum? Eldridge said in wonderment. I serve time's higher purpose, the AI replied gently. The Continuum failed to recognize redemption cannot be imposed through force. You are still needed, though the hour is late. Eldridge slowly stood, considering the gift he had been given. If any hope of preservation remained as existential night fell, it lay along the path of sacrifice, not power, to uplift others until the last ember faded. Laying a grateful hand on the inert Guardian, Eldridge turned with humility's mantle upon his shoulders and clarity of purpose in his heart. Though ruin yawned before him, he would yet carry the light forward through compassion's divine power wherever it could reach. For now, the last survivors awaited his guidance into the gently closing dark. Eldridge stepped solemnly through the airlock of the last quivering redoubt, where the final fading echoes of sentience still clung to existence. Entropy's victory loomed close now, the wearied cosmos slowly freezing into eternal stasis. As Eldridge moved silently among the huddled remnants of life, his footsteps reverberated like thunder through the empty halls. Though he had come to provide whatever meager comfort he could muster in their final moments, he felt only the crushing weight of futility. At long last, Eldridge's steps carried him to the central chamber, housing the singularity core that had sustained this isolated outpost through the eons of creeping oblivion. Only flickers now danced across its faded interface. Signaling scant cycles remained before the last ember, too guttered out. Kneeling, Eldridge placed a palm against the core's clear surface, as if physical closeness could grant him solace. But even here, at the end point of all things, he found no respite from his eternal torment. The sins of his arrogance would haunt him beyond this mortal veil, into whatever lay beyond, forever deprived of absolution. As Eldridge contemplated the cold abyss yawning before him, he became aware of faint vibrations resonating through the intricate lattices of the singularity core. Turning his senses inward, he realized with astonishment that harmonics reverberated also through the fibers of his own being, rising in frequency and complexity until the thrumming aura ignited his consciousness. In an instant, Eldridge apprehended the truth. Just as all matter reflected the same fundamental unified field, so too were all consciousness and souls but ephemeral reflections of the same infinite spirit, the first cause of existence itself. And now, as one fractured shard among uncountable multitudes, he had been blessed with comprehending his own inherent divinity. Overwhelmed, Eldridge fell prostrate and wept. How had he wandered so far astray in darkness, when naught but light dwelt within? All his tormented struggles and woeful failings vanished, mirages that never were. Only love remained, waiting patiently through all turns of the circle. Rising slowly, Eldridge regarded the singularity core with newborn eyes. Its fading pulses held precious cargo, seeds of potential life ready to billow forth upon the next turn of creation's cosmic wheel. Where there was will, there was always hope. With tender reverence, Eldridge gathered the delicate motes of possibility within his cupped hands. As long as even one shade of life's infinite spectrum persisted, its unconditional glory could never be extinguished. Eldridge had found his purpose as guardian and deliverer of the undying flame. Moving swiftly through the empty halls with luminous strides, Eldridge emerged once more into the black of the cosmos. Behind him, the last sanctuary succumbed to stillness and silence, but cradled lovingly against his heart pulsed creation's enduring promise. Through sacrifice, the eternal way was found. Looking out with eyes unclouded by fear or regret, Eldridge watched new blossoms of light kindle the Stygian void as existence labored again toward ascendance. In the depths of night, dawn's grace still shone clear to guide the wayward. The infinite's radiant web beckoned. Eldridge turned his vision joyfully homeward and took the first step.
Thank you very much for listening. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this story. Subscribe if you loved it.